The room was packed. Cameras swiveled, lights glared, and murmurs bounced off the walls like restless echoes. Everyone had come to see Paula White, the powerful preacher known for her charisma, her influence, and her close ties to political figures. The energy was electric, the kind that makes a crowd lean forward in expectation, waiting for the next word, the next revelation. And then he entered. Jonathan Roumie. Calm, composed, unassuming in his presence, yet carrying an aura that made heads turn. No flashy gestures. No loud announcements. Just a quiet certainty. The kind of certainty that makes you pause, even in a room filled with voices clamoring for attention. He walked toward the podium where Paula White stood, commanding the stage as she often did. The audience, sensing something unusual, fell into an almost reverent silence. Even the cameras seemed to tilt a little, as if the lenses themselves knew a moment was coming that couldn't be captured in ordinary frames. Jonathan stopped a few feet away. He looked her directly in the eye, not with anger, not with hostility, but with a calm intensity that made the air itself seem heavier. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The hum of the crowd faded. It was as if time itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Then, softly, deliberately, Jonathan spoke. 10 words. Just 10. Simple, clear, impossible to ignore. Those words were like a key unlocking a hidden truth in the room. The kind of truth that makes people shift in their seats, that causes whispers to ripple through the audience, that makes cameras jitter and pens scribble faster. Those 10 words were enough to pierce through layers of charisma, influence, and political spectacle. They weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. But their impact, immense. Paula White's expression changed subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet the change was enough for everyone paying attention to notice. The confidence she carried so effortlessly, the authority she wielded like a shield, it flickered for the first time. People gasped quietly, some leaned forward, and others exchanged glances, realizing something profound had just happened in front of them. In that moment, Jonathan Roumie didn't just speak. He held up a mirror. And the reflection it revealed was uncomfortable, undeniable, and unforgettable. The room was alive with expectation. It wasn't just another event, it was a stage where power, faith, and influence collided. Cameras hovered like vigilant hawks, capturing every gesture, every flicker of expression, every word that could make or break reputations. The audience was a mix of devout followers, curious onlookers, and journalists, all eager to witness the spectacle that had become synonymous with Paula White's public appearances. Paula White stepped onto the stage like she owned it, which, in many ways, she did. Her presence commanded attention, a magnetic force that drew eyes and hushed murmurs alike. She spoke with precision, her voice polished, confident, resonant. Every sentence was measured, every pause intentional. She radiated influence, not just through words, but through the aura of authority she had cultivated over decades. She was used to the spotlight, used to admiration, and certainly used to people nodding, agreeing, and applauding her every move. Meanwhile, Jonathan Roumie waited, just off to the side, almost unnoticed by many in the crowd. But there was a different kind of weight about him, subtle but undeniable. He wasn't loud. He didn't need the flash of lights or the nods of a crowd to validate his presence. Where Paula projected power through spectacle, Jonathan projected it through stillness and focus. His calm, measured demeanor stood in stark contrast to the surrounding energy, and that contrast was enough to make anyone paying attention shift their gaze. As Paula White spoke, she referenced the blending of faith and leadership, speaking to the many ways religious influence intersects with political power. Her words were smooth, practiced, designed to inspire and impress simultaneously. The audience reacted with polite applause, smiles, and nods. Some were inspired, some were skeptical. But for most, it was business as usual. Another day, another sermon delivered to a crowd hungry for guidance, affirmation, or both. Jonathan listened silently. His eyes never left her face. His body language was unassuming, almost casual, yet it held a quiet intensity that hinted at purpose. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react emotionally. He simply observed, absorbed, and waited. As the speech progressed, subtle shifts began to ripple through the room. Those familiar with Jonathan Roumie could feel it, the kind of energy that precedes moments of confrontation. Even those who didn't know him felt it, in the uneasy stares, the quiet shifting of feet, the tentative glances exchanged between audience members. Something was coming, and everyone instinctively knew it. And then, Jonathan began moving forward. The movement was deliberate, measured, and unhurried. Every step carried weight, though no one could yet articulate why. Cameras instinctively followed him. Heads turned. The room fell into a hush, the low buzz of anticipation swelling into an almost tangible pressure. For a brief moment, it was as if the entire crowd collectively realized that a pivotal moment in this event was about to unfold. Paula White noticed him then, truly noticed. Her eyes met his, and for a fraction of a second, the polished confidence that she usually wielded as armor seemed to falter. There was curiosity there, perhaps a flicker of caution, though she masked it quickly with a poised smile. She had faced critics before, challenged speakers, and confronted dissenters. But there was something different about the way Jonathan carried himself, a quiet authority that didn't need to assert dominance, yet somehow commanded attention all the same. Jonathan stopped a few feet from the podium. He didn't speak yet. He didn't gesture. He simply stood, calm and centered, his gaze steady, his posture unyielding. The audience felt it immediately. The tension in the room shifted from passive curiosity to alert awareness. Whispers started, subtle at first, growing louder as people began to exchange glances. Journalists leaned forward, fingers hovering over keyboards. Phones quietly rose to capture the moment. Then, Jonathan did something even more unusual. He waited. He waited not out of hesitation, but out of intent. In that pause, in that quiet before the storm, he communicated more than words ever could. His stillness became a statement, a question, and a challenge all at once. Paula White spoke again, trying to maintain control of the moment. She continued her sermon, referencing faith, morality, and leadership. But now, the room felt different. Her words seemed to hang, partially absorbed, partially scrutinized. Jonathan's presence introduced a weight to her speech that had not been there before. Every phrase, every carefully chosen sentence, was now filtered through a lens of accountability that she couldn't easily dismiss. The audience could sense the impending confrontation, even if they didn't yet know what form it would take. There was a collective awareness, subtle but electric, that a moment of truth was approaching, a moment that could challenge assumptions, question authority, and reveal hidden layers behind the polished veneer of the event. And then, just as the final segment of her speech concluded, Jonathan took a breath. The room quieted completely, as if even the air itself were holding its breath. Cameras focused, audience members leaned forward, and all eyes turned toward him. The stage was set. The tension was palpable. In that quiet, waiting moment, it was clear. Jonathan Roumie was about to speak, and whatever he said next would not just be heard, it would resonate, leaving an impression that no one in that room would soon forget. The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop, or at least feel the absence of all the usual noise. Cameras whirred faintly, but even their mechanical hum seemed subdued under the weight of anticipation. Every eye was on Jonathan Roumie, standing a few feet from Paula White, calm and unshaken, yet radiating a presence that made people lean forward involuntarily. He opened his mouth, and the first word didn't roar, it resonated. Clear, measured, deliberate. 10 words. 10 words that would cut through the spectacle, the rehearsed smiles, and the carefully curated authority of a room used to being guided, not confronted. Faith cannot be measured by power, influence, or political gain, he said. The words landed like a stone skipping across water, sending ripples across the audience. Gasps. Murmurs. A few audience members exchanged glances, uncertain whether to applaud or recoil. Some scribbled furiously in notebooks, desperate to capture the statement that seemed to pierce the usual noise. Others raised their phones, instinctively recording what was unfolding, knowing instinctively that this moment would not be forgotten. Paula White's expression shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The confidence she had exuded like armor now showed cracks. Her practiced smile faltered for just a heartbeat, replaced by a flash of calculation, as if she were quickly assessing whether this confrontation was accidental or deliberate. The aura of command she carried into the room wavered under the quiet precision of Jonathan's gaze. The silence was palpable, heavy enough that the very air seemed to hold its breath. Journalists and attendees felt it instinctively. The room had transitioned from entertainment to reckoning. This wasn't a debate. This wasn't a sermon. This was accountability delivered in its purest, simplest form. Some people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. They had come to be inspired, perhaps entertained, and now they were witnessing a truth too clear to ignore. Even those who supported Paula White felt a moment of pause. The 10 words were not accusatory, they were reflective, factual, and unavoidable. They demanded thought, reflection, and self-assessment. Paula White tried to regain control, to steer the energy back to familiarity. Her voice rose slightly, practiced gestures following. She spoke of faith, of guidance, of her mission. Yet each word now felt measured against Jonathan's statement, filtered through the lens of challenge he had introduced. She was still a masterful communicator, but even mastery cannot fully erase the mirror held up before it. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesticulate. He didn't demand attention. He simply stood, calm, letting his words resonate in the silence. Each pause he allowed between sentences became a punctuation mark, emphasizing what he had already said. It was a technique honed from years of practice, speaking truth in a way that cannot be ignored, cannot be dismissed, cannot be forgotten. Some audience members whispered. Some leaned forward. A few mouths hung open. Phones captured every angle. Even the journalists, trained to remain neutral and detached, found themselves caught in the raw gravity of the moment. The power dynamic of the room had shifted. No longer was it a stage for spectacle, it had become a chamber of reflection. Paula White, momentarily caught off guard, regained a small measure of composure. She smiled, yet the smile was different now, less armor, more consideration. She realized, in that fleeting instant, that the person in front of her was not merely a challenger. He was a mirror. He reflected back what had been hidden beneath years of curated image and strategic influence. Jonathan's gaze never wavered. His presence was steady, unwavering, yet filled with compassion. There was no hatred, no anger, no desire to shame, only a simple, unshakable truth. And in that truth, the audience could feel something shift. They weren't witnessing a confrontation aimed at destruction. They were witnessing clarity, accountability, and courage. The 10 words had done their work. The echo lingered in the room. And as Jonathan took a slight step back, the weight of the moment hung in the air. For some, it was uncomfortable. For others, liberating. For all, unforgettable. In that charged silence, a new reality had emerged. Truth does not need to be loud to be heard. And courage does not need applause to command attention. The room, once alive with expectation and spectacle, had been transformed. Every eye, every heart, every mind was now contemplating the words spoken. And somewhere in that contemplation, the possibility of change had been planted, a seed that no amount of influence or performance could erase. The room was suspended in a strange, almost electric silence. The words Jonathan Roumie had spoken weren't loud, but they carried a weight that seemed to press against every wall, every ceiling tile, and every person present. For a moment, the crowd didn't know how to breathe. They had come expecting a performance, a sermon, a routine display of influence. Instead, they had witnessed a moment that demanded reflection. Some attendees whispered to each other, barely audible, words like, "Did he just?" and "I can't believe he said that," drifting like ghosts in the air. Others clutched their phones, replaying the words in their minds or recording them for social media, knowing instinctively that this was no ordinary clip. It would go viral, ripple through communities, spark debates, and leave lasting impressions. The journalists, who had come expecting a polished presentation from Paula White, were now scrambling to adjust their notes. Some scribbled frantically, capturing not just the statement, but the tension in the room, the subtle shifts in expression, the way authority and humility collided on the stage. Others paused, realizing that the real story wasn't about celebrity or spectacle. It was about accountability and courage, distilled into 10 words that pierced through layers of curated image. Paula White, standing at the podium, was momentarily still. The practiced cadence of her speech had been interrupted. She had faced critics before, confronted challenges, and navigated controversies, yet there was something disarming about the way Jonathan's words landed. They were not accusatory, nor disrespectful. They were precise, reflective, and undeniable. For the first time, she hesitated mid-thought, the smile on her face tinged with a momentary flicker of surprise. Audience members reacted differently, depending on their perspective. Some nodded slowly, impressed by the courage it took to speak truth in a room dominated by charisma and influence. Others leaned back, discomfort by the implicit critique of political entanglements within religious leadership. And a few stared silently, grappling with the tension between admiration for Jonathan's courage and loyalty to the speaker they had come to support. A ripple of conversations began spreading throughout the crowd. "Did you hear what he said?" someone whispered. "That changes everything," another replied. People debated quietly, weighing intention versus impact, truth versus image, reflection versus entertainment. The dynamic of the room had shifted entirely. The energy was no longer just performance, it was scrutiny, thought, and awareness. Meanwhile, Jonathan stood still, letting the words settle, letting the room breathe around them. There was no triumph in his posture, no pretense of victory. He didn't need to assert dominance. The silence itself was a companion to the words he had spoken, amplifying their weight. He had not sought applause, and yet, in the stillness, every eye was fixed upon him. His calmness was a mirror for the crowd, showing them that integrity does not shout, it resonates. Paula White finally broke the silence, carefully choosing her next words. She spoke with poise, acknowledging the importance of faith and leadership, but there was a subtle difference now, less performative, more reflective. Those watching closely noticed it. The usual armor of charisma had softened, replaced by a moment of genuine contemplation. The audience sensed it too. Whispers turned into thoughtful nods. For some, it was the first time they saw a human behind the stage persona. Outside the room, social media exploded. Clips of Jonathan's confrontation were shared widely, each one dissected, discussed, and debated. Influencers, commentators, and followers all began dissecting the 10 words, debating their meaning, and reflecting on their significance. The story wasn't just local, it had global resonance, challenging viewers to consider accountability, faith, and courage in leadership. Even long after the event, the tension lingered. Attendees replayed the scene in their minds, pondering the courage required to confront influence with integrity. They discussed the implications, questioned assumptions, and considered the broader meaning. The simple act of speaking truth, in a moment saturated with spectacle and authority, had ignited reflection in every corner of the room. Jonathan, having delivered his words, did not linger. He didn't seek accolades, applause, or validation. He stepped back quietly, allowing the impact to breathe, letting the truth ripple outward on its own momentum. The room remained charged with energy, a mixture of awe, contemplation, and a new awareness that things could never return to the same, that the equilibrium of power had shifted, if only subtly. In that charged space, one realization became clear. The true measure of courage is not in confrontation itself, but in the ability to speak truth in a world that rewards spectacle over substance. And as the audience processed what they had just witnessed, one thing was undeniable. The 10 words spoken had done more than challenge authority. They had exposed the heart of the matter, leaving an impression that no image, no sermon, and no performance could ever erase. The room had shifted. What had started as a routine event, a sermon, a speech, a gathering of faith and influence, had become something entirely different. Silence lingered, thick with anticipation, as the audience processed the weight of Jonathan Roumie's words. The 10 words he had spoken were simple, precise, and undeniable, yet their implications stretched far beyond the walls of that room. They challenged assumptions, questioned authority, and demanded reflection. Paula White remained at the podium, her usual composure tempered by subtle acknowledgement of the moment's gravity. She glanced at Jonathan, then back at the crowd. Something in her eyes flickered, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. She had been confronted not with anger or malice, but with clarity. And clarity has a way of piercing the most carefully constructed facades. The audience was still. Some leaned forward, straining to catch every movement, every nuance. Others whispered quietly, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Phones continued recording, capturing expressions of astonishment, reflection, and realization. Even those who had come expecting entertainment felt the undeniable gravity of the encounter. Then came the first subtle acknowledgments. A few attendees who had initially reacted with skepticism began to nod, slowly, almost imperceptibly. They recognized the truth in Jonathan's words, not as an attack, but as a mirror held up to an institution that had often blended faith with political influence. Others, hesitant at first, began to murmur agreements, small but deliberate signs that the impact of those 10 words was rippling outward, beyond the stage and into thought, conscience, and conversation. Paula White cleared her throat. The practiced cadence of her speech returned, but there was a different tone now, less performative, more reflective. She spoke about faith, about leadership, about the responsibilities that come with influence. But her words were filtered through the lens Jonathan had introduced: accountability, integrity, and the courage to face truth. For the first time, the room sensed not just a speaker, but a human being grappling with the implications of her own position and choices. And then the moment of revelation came, not from grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through the subtle shifts that spoke louder than words ever could. Journalists, recording every angle, began to notice the small interactions. A pause here, a nod there, the tension in posture easing ever so slightly. The audience began to understand that what they were witnessing was not just a confrontation, it was an unveiling. Jonathan stepped forward slightly, his presence calm but commanding. He didn't raise his voice or gesture wildly. He allowed the silence to accentuate the weight of the moment. And then, in a quiet, almost intimate manner, he spoke again, not to attack, but to illuminate. Faith is not a tool for influence. Truth is not a commodity to be traded. The words resonated across the room like a soft, insistent wave, reaching every corner, touching every listener. The significance was unmistakable. The confrontation had revealed something deeper, something that had been obscured beneath layers of image, influence, and performance. It was a reminder that integrity cannot be compromised, that courage is measured not by spectacle but by the willingness to speak truth in the presence of power. Audience members began reacting more openly. Some stood, applauding quietly, a mix of admiration and acknowledgement. Others shook their heads, not in disapproval, but in the realization that they had been complicit, even unintentionally, in allowing spectacle to overshadow substance. The room was alive with reflection, a collective understanding that the encounter had shifted something fundamental. Even Paula White responded, not with confrontation, but with subtle acceptance. She nodded, acknowledging the truth of the statement without words. In that silent acknowledgement, the full revelation of the moment crystallized. Jonathan's words had not been an attack, they had been an exposure, a mirror reflecting both the responsibility and the vulnerability inherent in leadership. The media, still recording, began to capture not just the event, but the transformation. Social media feeds were flooded with clips, quotes, and commentary. The impact of those 10 words extended far beyond the room, challenging viewers around the world to reconsider their own assumptions about faith, leadership, and integrity. And in the quiet aftermath, as the audience absorbed what had transpired, one undeniable truth emerged. The power of Jonathan Roumie's confrontation lay not in spectacle, not in volume, and not in conflict. It lay in clarity, courage, and the unflinching commitment to speak truth, even in a room designed for applause. The reveal was complete. The confrontation had done more than challenge authority, it had illuminated it. It had exposed the tension between faith and influence, between image and substance, and, ultimately, between the courage to act and the responsibility to lead with integrity. For everyone present, the lesson was clear. Sometimes, it only takes 10 words to change a room, to challenge assumptions, and to awaken reflection that can ripple far beyond the moment. The energy in the room had shifted from tension to reflection. What had begun as a routine event, a public appearance, a sermon, a display of influence, had transformed into something far deeper. People were no longer merely spectators. They were witnesses to a confrontation that challenged assumptions, demanded introspection, and left a lasting imprint on everyone present. Jonathan Roumie remained calm, his posture steady, his gaze unwavering. He hadn't sought attention, applause, or validation. His goal was simpler and more profound: to illuminate truth, to hold a mirror up to power, and to remind everyone in the room that courage and integrity are measured not by spectacle but by conviction. Audience members slowly began to exhale, some in relief, others in contemplation. The initial shock of his 10 words had worn off, leaving behind a quiet clarity. Conversations began to ripple through the crowd. People discussed what they had seen, debated its implications, and reflected on how faith and influence often intertwine in ways that can obscure truth. Paula White, still at the podium, took a measured step back from her performance. For the first time in that room, the armor of charisma and authority seemed softened. She glanced at Jonathan again, and this time, her expression carried acknowledgement rather than defense. There was no grand apology, no dramatic concession, just a quiet recognition that the moment had changed the dynamic irreversibly. "What you said," she began, her voice careful, measured. "It wasn't just words. It was a reminder." She paused, looking around at the audience, seeing them not as followers, but as human beings capable of reflection, discernment, and moral thought. Sometimes, we forget that faith is meant to guide, not to dominate. Influence is a responsibility, not a prize. The audience sensed the gravity of her admission, subtle though it was. Some nodded slowly, absorbing the unspoken truth behind her words. Others whispered to neighbors, acknowledging that what had unfolded was more than confrontation, it was revelation. The air was thick with introspection, an almost tangible sense that something important had been unearthed and could no longer be ignored. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the pause to stretch, giving weight to the space between confrontation and understanding. In that silence, the audience felt the power of reflection. There was no need for dramatics, no need for shouting or performance. The impact had already landed, resonating in every mind and heart present. Finally, he spoke, gently but firmly. Faith should elevate, never manipulate. Integrity must lead where influence falters. And courage is speaking truth, even when the world expects silence. His words weren't confrontational, they were clarifying, almost like a guidepost for those willing to listen. The murmurs began to grow into conversation. Audience members reflected not only on the event itself, but on what it meant for their personal beliefs, their understanding of leadership, and their awareness of accountability. What had seemed like a public spectacle had become a catalyst for introspection, and many recognized that the lessons extended far beyond that room. Some attendees approached Jonathan quietly, expressing gratitude for his courage and clarity. Others lingered in silence, processing the confrontation and the emotional weight it carried. Even journalists, trained to remain detached, acknowledged the depth of the moment. They had witnessed not just a challenge to authority, but a demonstration of the power of integrity in action. Paula White, after a long pause, nodded once, subtly, almost imperceptibly. In that gesture was acceptance, acknowledgement, and perhaps even a hint of transformation. She did not need to vocalize agreement. The acknowledgement was in the shared understanding that truth, courage, and integrity cannot be ignored. They ripple outward, beyond moments, beyond stages, and beyond performances. As the event concluded, the audience left with more than just an experience. They carried a lesson. Some reflected on how they, too, could prioritize integrity over image, humility over influence, and truth over spectacle. Others contemplated the courage it takes to speak difficult truths in a world that rewards conformity and applause. Outside the venue, the ripple effects were immediate. Clips of Jonathan's confrontation went viral. Social media buzzed with commentary, analysis, and admiration. People debated the meaning, shared their interpretations, and discussed the broader implications for faith, leadership, and personal integrity. The impact of 10 carefully chosen words had spread far beyond the walls of the room, sparking conversations around the world. In the quiet aftermath, Jonathan left the stage without fanfare. He didn't linger for applause or recognition. He had said what needed to be said, and the moment had already taken root. The lesson was clear. True courage is not performative. True integrity is not about visibility. And real power is measured not by influence, but by the ability to act rightly when it matters most. The room, once charged with expectation, now carried a quiet resonance. Each attendee left with the knowledge that they had witnessed something rare, a confrontation that didn't aim to humiliate or dominate, but to illuminate and awaken. And as they dispersed, the lesson remained vivid in their minds. Courage and truth have a ripple effect far greater than any staged spectacle. The echoes of that day lingered long after the crowd had dispersed. What had begun as a routine event, another gathering of faith, influence, and performance, had transformed into a lesson in courage, integrity, and the quiet but undeniable power of truth. Jonathan Roumie's 10 words had not only confronted authority but had illuminated a deeper principle, that respect, honesty, and accountability are the true markers of leadership, far beyond charisma or public acclaim. In the aftermath, the audience carried the moment with them, replaying it in their minds. Some reflected quietly during their commute, on the bus, or walking home. Others replayed videos, reading comments, dissecting every nuance, every pause, every look exchanged between Jonathan and Paula White. The conversation had expanded beyond the room. It was now alive on social media, in conversations at dinner tables, and in private reflections among friends. People debated, questioned, and, above all, thought critically about the intersection of faith and influence. The moral was undeniable: integrity cannot be borrowed, borrowed respect cannot last, and true courage does not need a spotlight. Jonathan's approach had been simple yet profound. He spoke without malice, without anger, without the need for approval. His power did not come from dominance or spectacle. It came from clarity, from the ability to speak truth in a way that could not be ignored, dismissed, or diminished. And that was the beauty of the moment. So often, the world rewards loudness, performance, and intimidation. Leaders are applauded for their charisma rather than their character. Influence is measured by followers rather than principles. Yet Jonathan's confrontation reminded everyone present, and everyone watching, that real strength is measured quietly, in how one acts when the stakes are highest, when the world expects silence, or when the applause is absent. Even Paula White, despite the initial tension and subtle surprise, had responded not with hostility but with acknowledgement. She had seen the mirror he held up, not as a weapon, but as a reflection of accountability and truth. And that, perhaps more than the confrontation itself, was the ultimate revelation: that integrity can unsettle even the most confident, but it can also guide and inspire transformation. For those in the room, the takeaway was clear: humility is not weakness. Courage is not performative. Respect is not conditional. Jonathan's calm, deliberate approach demonstrated that even a few words, spoken with conviction and clarity, can spark reflection, challenge assumptions, and influence change in ways that spectacle and rhetoric never could. As the event faded into memory, the lesson spread further. Clips of Jonathan's 10 words circulated online, gaining millions of views, sparking dialogue across platforms. People from all walks of life shared their interpretations, debated its meaning, and discussed how the principles of courage, accountability, and integrity could be applied in their own lives. It was a reminder that leadership is not about power or visibility. It is about character and the willingness to act rightly when it matters most. Jonathan himself did not seek recognition or praise. He left quietly, the weight of his words resonating with those willing to listen, and those who had learned that courage and truth do not require spectacle to be heard. The event became a case study, a story shared in classrooms, offices, and online forums, not because of conflict or drama, but because of the profound lesson embedded in a moment of quiet, unwavering conviction. And perhaps the most enduring lesson of all was simple: the measure of true influence is not in who you command, but in the courage to speak truth even when it challenges authority. The measure of true leadership is not applause, but the ability to illuminate, guide, and inspire reflection in a way that outlasts any event or performance. For everyone who witnessed that day, the moral was clear: be courageous, be truthful, and act with integrity. Speak your truths, even when it is uncomfortable. Hold power accountable, even when it is inconvenient. And remember that respect, humility, and honesty are the foundations of leadership that lasts far beyond fame, fortune, or influence. Type truth in the comments if you believe in the strength of courage and integrity. Share where you're watching from, because the world needs more voices willing to speak honestly, to challenge quietly, and to lead with character. The lesson of that day was simple, yet profound. Even 10 words, spoken with clarity, courage, and conviction, can create ripples strong enough to awaken thought, inspire action, and transform hearts. And in a world often dominated by spectacle and influence, moments like this remind us that true power lies not in the spotlight, but in the quiet strength of truth.